Greetings. In this video, we'll take what we learned about set-driven, clusters, and blend-shaped deformers, and we'll incorporate those on your basic sculpt head. Before we move on to your more complex polygonal model of your head, we'll practice these techniques on just a basic sculpt. It will make selecting the vertexes a little bit simpler. So let's get started. This is what we're ultimately going to create, right? We can see those deformations happening on the face. We have a locator that has both surprise and angry, right? I can scrub up to surprise, and I can scrub up to angry, right? And then we've set keys on surprise and angry and just created a little demo of that animation. So let's execute this from scratch. I'm going to just go ahead and delete all of the clusters. And let's get this back to scratch. I'll unparent. And here we just have our simple sculpt, right? This is not a model that's going to give us great facial muscular rig because the edges are just running horizontal and vertical. When you look at that head model tutorial, there are great effort given to having the edge flow follow the musculature of the face so that when we're creating the clusters and executing the clusters, those edges follow the natural musculature of the face. We've just got this basic sculpt here running horizontal and vertical, and this will be good for us to learn on. Let's create our first cluster. We'll use the paint select tool. So here is our paint select. You may want to go back and forth between turning this off. I want to see where my brow is, but making the selections might be a little bit easier. Now you can see I've got reflect on, so I want to turn that off. So I'm going to come to the paint tool, stroke, and I'm turning off reflection. So I've just got it here. Right, this is our paint select tool. Use the B key to make it larger or smaller, and this will just give us a real convenient way. And I want to see, right, where would my brow be? Another strategy is you're selecting a little bit more than you want. You can deselect and paint off very easily, but it's more of a challenge to add to the selection. So you can over select and then just paint off the influence by painting it black or smoothing it down. In our case, we're going to smooth it and then we'll come back and add a little bit of white right to the brow area itself. So I've got a selection that I like, and we'll come up to deform. We'll come up to deform, create cluster. And if you just execute it, remember that the cluster is just going to work at 1-to-1, right? So that just pulls straight out, right? If the vertex was included in the cluster, it's been transformed. If the vertex was not included, it has remained behind. And so what we can even do is flood smooth this in position. So I'll pull that up there, maybe easier to see with this off. And remember that when we're using the paint weights for the deformers, we have the surface selected, and we have to have it selected in object mode. So I have my mesh selected. Not the cluster itself, just the mesh. And we'll come to deform, down to cluster, and we'll open the dialog box. And here we see, right, that 1-to-1, and we've got smooth selected, and we'll just flood that. And you see how we're knocking that down. And that is a decent looking brow selection. And then what you can also do is come to add, and if the value is 1, it will paint white. And we can just put a little bit here. Now that's jumping up to 100%, and we'll just knock that down with a little bit flood. So this will really emphasize the area of the brow, but it has a nice soft fall off. It will give you an organic look. We'll come back to select the cluster, we'll bring the texture back on, and so you can see now we can raise our brow and lower our brow, and anytime you want to get it back, you can just zero out, and there is its original position. We can raise it. If you rotate it outward, right? If you rotate it outward, it's kind of quizzical. If you lower it and rotate it the other direction, it is kind of angry, right? So we can get some emotions going just from the position of the cluster itself. Let's do the eye next. So I'm going to come and use my paint select tool. B key, left mouse button will change the size of that. I'll just make it about the size of the eye and maybe a little bit larger. Remember that we can go larger because it's easy to paint off, but it's more of a challenge to add after you've already created the cluster. So now we don't have an eyelid here. We're just going to kind of squish the eye down with our cluster. Another reason that we're not going to get really high-end results from using a sculpt, but it's fine for us to learn on. We'll come and create the cluster. You want to test the cluster. Oftentimes you may get a vertex or something off the back, so you can just pull that out, right, and see if anything else is coming along, and it's not, so that's a good selection. Now it's 1-to-1, so if I was going to try and squeeze that down, right, we're getting just that 1-to-1. So let's paint it. We'll smooth it. We have the surface selected. Come and pick the surface. We'll come to deform all the way down to cluster dialog box. And then here's another little kind of quirky thing about the weight painting tool. It dumped me into the first one, and we're done with that. So how do we switch between clusters? It's right here. And this is not intuitive at all that you would click here to find it. But you click on cluster, hit cluster, and then now we'll pull down to the second one, which is the one that I've created here. You see that's 1-to-1. We'll smooth it a bunch of times, right? We want to smooth those edges, and then let's paint just a little bit of white. We'll come to add, the value is 1, and we'll just put a little bit of white right in the middle, and then we'll flood smooth that a little bit. That'll give us a nice deformation. We'll come back to the outliner, pick the cluster that we were just looking at, and you can see you can scale it. I think what we're doing is just scaling it on the Y. And this is using the scale tool. Double click the scale tool, hit reset if that wasn't working for you. If you'd set this to component in a previous project, you want to make sure that you're changing this in the default. So we'll come back to the outliner and we can kind of create a facsimile of the eye closing. All right, now you're going to do that on the other side for both of those. Remember your general selections. There are methods for copying and pasting, but I'd like you to just practice making those selections, practice going through the process. Now, the jaw, and one of the reasons that we talked about having, as we were painting, if you think back to that lesson, we painted right along an edge, and this will allow us to make a selection. In this case, I do want, I'm going to double click the paint select, and let's turn reflection on, and we'll just select both. I want the whole bottom of the jaw, right? You can make the brush larger, and this comes all the way up right to here. You've got your control key to deselect, right? And we're just selecting. Remember, it's okay to over select because it's easy to paint off. I will get a good selection right up to this edge. Maybe that one there. Okay, so we've got a jaw selection. Let's make sure we've got all this here on the bottom. And you can test even before you create, right? I can pull that down, and we see we don't have anything on the back of the skull. We've got a good selection. So we'll create that, right? We'll come up to Deform, Create Cluster. We will pick the surface so that we can come and paint weights. And actually, before we paint weights, let me talk about one thing. So the cluster, we want the jaw to open with a pivot from here. So having the pivot in the center of the eye is fine. Having the pivot in the center of the brow is fine. When you get to your more complex head, when you're creating the lids, you'll put the pivot of the cluster for the lid in the center of your eyeball shape. Here we're moving the pivot. I'm using the D key and just pushing that back to about where you'd imagine your jaw is hinged. And so this cluster is rotating right back from there. And we'll leave this open and we'll watch it smooth in real time. We want to pick the skull as an object, our mesh as an object, and we'll come down to paint weights, right? It dumps us in our first one, so we'll click here, come over to cluster weights. There it is. We'll hit flood smooth a bunch of times. And if you wanted to paint a little bit of white here, you could. We'll take a look at how this deforms. Okay, we'll come back, we'll grab that cluster, and right, this is all right. We're not getting a true mouth opening, right? We don't have a cavity for the mouth. We're just getting some deformations going on this basic skull to warm us up for our actual polyhead, our complex polyhead model. Just using this as a warm-up. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. I'm going to create the clusters for my other lid, and then we'll come back in a moment. Okay, so you've created your two brows, right? I can select them both here, and we can raise them. We can select both the eyes here and scale them, and we can click the jaw, and the pivot is offset, and we can get just a basic mouth action. Note we've labeled them here: cluster brow left, brow right, eye right, and jaw, just to make things easier in your outliner. And so now we're going to take the work that we did here. We're working at the origin, and we're going to offset it for our blend shape target. Now you could have just duplicated it and worked directly on the blend shape target, but generally you're practicing on your singular head here, and once you've got it working the way that you want it, we will group it. So we're going to say edit group, and we're going to duplicate this over for our blend shape target. We can see everything here is included. We've got this group, and we'll come to duplicate special, right? For the group, I've got the group selected. Duplicate special, and we want input graph. Duplicate input graph, not connections graph. And we'll just slide this over, and this is going to be our workhorse. This is going to be our target. And we can actually just even create a third. Let's do, because we're going to do surprise and angry, or just two extreme positions. So we'll also duplicate a second target, and we'll move it over. So we'll be making our kind of happy surprise here, our angry here. We'll blend shape those down to this base head. And just to help you understand why we're using this method, I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of those original clusters on this base head, right? We're not going to do any direct deformation to the face on the base head. This will make it very clean and easy to rig this. In the case of a bipedal skeleton, you can bind this or parent it, and the deformations will happen on top. The blend shape is a very clean way of affecting the base head. And if you're using this for the Jack-in-the-Box, we can now constrain this head that doesn't have any deformations on it. It's easy to point and orient, constrain it to our Jack-in-the-Box spring rig. So we're doing all the kind of heavy lifting over here on the blend shape targets, and that blend shape mechanism is very clean into this head that we will rig either for your bipedal character or for your Jack-in-the-Box character. Yeah, let's go ahead and put these on some layers, right? So I can, we'll say that's base angry layer, and we'll hide that, and we can say that this one is going to be, oh, I said base, I'm sorry, this is target angry layer, and this is target, let's say surprise layer. And so we'll leave this one on, right? That target angry layers over there, we'll turn it off. We'll create target surprise layer, and let's come in and we'll first of all kind of get our brows up there. The reason that we did two separate is so that we could rotate them separately. So surprised is generally over and out. How high you want to go is up to you. We'll pull that over and rotate it out, right? We can come to the eyes here and we can just scale those up a little bit. I don't know if you want to have them kind of, yeah, you could have them kind of poke out a little bit. And then we'll come to our jaw and we'll just raise that. So he is surprised. And we can go ahead and create our blend shape target right now. And let's do it for both, even though we haven't executed anything here. One other thing that you may want to do before we include it, let's give ourselves even a fourth. So we're going to come up and duplicate this, duplicate input graph, and we'll just use this as a reserve. Because once we get these in the blend shape, they're given over and we want to have just the flexibility of coming in and adding an additional that doesn't have any deformations on it yet. So we'll just have this as a reserve. We'll hide that away. If you use it, great. If you don't use it, doesn't have any effect on you. So remember that we can create as many targets as we want, and we just want to select in reverse order. And note that we're not selecting the group. We are just selecting the mesh. Just selecting the mesh. That's the only thing that blends shapes. And if I'm selecting here, I'm using my control key to skip select, but I've got this polysphere, and then we'll finally come to our base. So target, base is selected last. Target 1, target 2, base is selected last. And we'll come up to blend shape. And now if we open the editor, Window Animation Editor's Shape Editor, right, we've got the two that we can scrub here. And this second one is our surprise, and we haven't done anything to angry yet, so we don't see any scrubbing there. So we've got this set up. Let's do our angry now. You could have done angry first and created that at once, but I just wanted to show you that. So I'll hide my surprise, and now let's come over, and we know that this is group 3, and we could even, if we wanted to, call that angry target and surprise target, and we'll call this one our reserve. And so we're on our angry target. Our brows will typically just go the opposite direction. Now that looks sad. If you were going for sad, that would work. And so we want to rotate those inward. That's why we did them separately. And so with them rotated inward, I don't want to penetrate my model. That other one gave me some penetration there. Maybe we'll pull that up a little bit and pull this up a little bit so we're not penetrating ourselves. Our eyes narrow when we're angry, right? And our jaw tends to clench. Let's see. We could try it either way. Because he looks a little more intimidating open, right? And you can, maybe we'll try that. And we just created the blend shape target, so we can open that again. Window, Animation Editor's Shape Editor, and there's our angry, There's our happy. We can hide these. We can even delete them, but I don't recommend that. Just have them saved away. And in fact, as we're animating, you wouldn't delete those because we're going to come back and make additional, potentially, and then depending on the scene, you can always come back here and change that. Maybe the eyes are bugging out a little bit too much for the particular view that you end up with, right? So the particular camera angle or the scenario may warrant that you come back here and update those. But we've got this guy, and there's angry, and there's surprised. And remember that we're not going to animate on the blend shape editor. We're going to create a locator that just has those and it drives the blend shape. And that's because the locator can have other kinds of attributes attributed to it, whereas the blend shape editor is only showing us the blend shapes. So we'll have this available, and we'll do the final step of creating our locator. And let's go ahead and we'll call it our character control. And we'll come to Window, General Editors, Channel Control. We'll hide all that. We'll add an attribute, modify, add attribute. We'll call this angry. 0 is not angry, 1 is angry, and we'll say OK. And we'll add a second attribute, modify, add attribute. We'll say surprised. 0 is not surprised, 1 is surprised, and we'll say OK. And now we need to plug those in. And let me just remember, so this 2 is surprised and 1 is angry, so that tracks there. And now we'll open our set driven and we'll load these in. So our driver will start with angry. And remember, it's a little bit, it's not intuitive how you get the shape editor into the driven. If I just say load, it's going to load the transform. So we want to come to the blend shape itself, right click and say select. And now we can load the driven. And angry is linked to polysphere 1. And remember, we're just going to establish the two positions. It says key here, but we'll imagine that it's established. So character control angry, and let's select it. Make sure you've got both attributes selected. Angry is 0, and so this is where we want this at 0, and so we'll hit key. Character control angry is 1. We'll come back to blend shape polysphere 1, and we'll scrub it up to 1, and we'll hit key. And so now you want to test that. You can type that in, you can click on it, test that. There's 0, there's 1. Let's do surprise, character control surprise. It's going to be driving 2. So when this is 0, this is 0, and we'll hit key. Character control surprise is 1. We'll go blend shape poly 2, 1, and we'll hit key. And now you can see there's 0 and there is 1, and we can key these directly. Yeah, and let's do just a simple example here. I'll give myself, let's say, 75 frames. At frame 1, we'll key both of these. And let's say he just remains still to frame 10. And then from 10 to 20, let's say he gets surprised. And we'll just key them both for consistency. Holds his surprised face to 30. So we'll key that again, right? There's no action between 20 and 30. And then let's have it come down. Right? We want both of these at 0, comes to a neutral. And then, let's say he holds that for a moment. We'll key it. And then he gets angry. We'll put that there. We'll key them both. And he holds his angry face for a moment. And then so we can make this loop at the very end, we'll put them both to 0 again, key them. And now you've got surprised and angry. All right, questions in the forum. Thank you.